For the love of our Holy Prophet Muhammad, let us have a loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And for the love of the awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjalallahu ta'ala faraj al-Sharif, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله الحمد لله الذي كان موجودا قبل حدوث الأشياء ويبقى بعد فناء الأشياء سبحان الله الذي منه خلقت العباد وإليه المعاد فمن يعمل مثقال ذرة خيرا يره ومن يعمل مثقال ذرة شرا يره نشهد أن لا إله إلا هو الملك الذي لا ينازع في ملكه ولا يضاد في حكمه يعذب من يشاء بما يشاء كيف يشاء ويرحم من يشاء بما يشاء كيف يشاء تعذيبه المسيئين عدل وعفو تفضل ونشهد أن محمدا سيد المرسلين وخير المبشرين والمنذرين صلى الله عليه وآله الهداة المهديين من ركب سفينتهم نجا واهتدى ومن تخلف عنها ضل فغرق وهوى إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أوصيكم بالتقوى الله والورع في ديننا. I call myself and all of you towards God consciousness and piety in the way of the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Inshallah, we will be starting a new series for the 5 lectures of Arba'een, starting on Sunday night and lasting until Thursday evening, in order for us to commemorate the 40 days after the martyrdom of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. And the series is going to be discussing the topic of the sunan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The practices, the behaviors of Allah, the laws that Allah puts into the universe that govern the way in which we interact with the universe. Some of them are physical laws, some of them are metaphysical laws. If I said to you, what is a physical law that governs our world? For example, if I drop a pound coin, it will fall to the floor. This is, of course, gravity. Allah has put into the world the idea of gravity, and this is a law that governs the universe. Are there metaphysical laws that govern the universe? Laws that would be in the realm of how Allah has desired the cause and effect of creation itself. That if I act in a certain way, or a people act in a certain way, Allah has governed the universe to respond in a certain way. These are called the sunan of Allah, the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَحْوِيلًا. By no means does the sunnah, the laws of Allah, ever change. You will not find any change in the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And inshallah, we will discuss what these laws are that actually govern the universe, govern our interaction with the world. And inshallah, that will be our discussion over the coming nights from Sunday night. I want to be able to just show you an example of what I want to be able to talk about. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has certain laws that govern. Those sometimes can be physical laws, metaphysical laws, even spiritual laws. And he says that if you do this, this is the outcome. Or when you do this, this will be the response that I, God, have to be able to give to you in your life. or give to you as a people. So please open your Qur'ans to chapter number 4 of the Qur'an, Surah An-Nisa, verse 160, 161. Everybody's got the verse, inshallah? Chapter number 4, Surah An-Nisa, verse 160 and then 161, inshallah. Now, in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives to us the logic for how He has to be able to change the laws upon the Jews in order to discipline them because of what they have done. So just think about this for a second and understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in His sunnah will sometimes change the laws of a people because He sees them either acting a certain way or not acting a certain way. Let's take a step back. How many times have you seen in the Quran and heard in the history that Banu Israel were unable to overcome the shirk that lay within them? You've heard this many times. Most famous story is the issue of the cow, right? Allah would tell them, slaughter a cow, any cow, and this will be a means for you to be able to prove what happened with the murder in your midst. Then, because they had been worshipping a cow, the idea of slaughtering a cow, even though God tells them to do it, is something very difficult for them, isn't it? So they do what they can to avoid slaughtering a cow. So they try to mock. They say, well, is it this type of cow or is it that type of cow? Is it this type of cow or is it that type of cow? And every time they try to widen their options, Allah uses the same verses to narrow their options until they had to kill the very one cow that they didn't want to have to kill. So Allah is trying to get rid of their shirk, but they are so, they're so, what's the word I want to use? They're so rigid on their shirk, they're so dependent on their shirk, they're so ostensibly reliant on their shirk that whatever they do it to respond against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Throughout the course of the Quran, you see that Banu Israel are constantly having to be disciplined. Famous one as an example, Banu Israel, want only to be able to make money and they won't leave their businesses for anything. So Allah asks them, please keep aside Saturday as a day of worship for me. Some of them did it, some of them wouldn't do it. What happened? Some of them would sneak off and try to claim that they were just going fishing, for themselves. Really, they were fishing for their businesses so they could put it out the next day, right? They were trying to pull the wool over the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In order to discipline them, Allah made the day of Saturday compulsory for them. Not only no business, but He made it very hard for them, didn't it? In order to discipline them. And until now, you see some of them, they can't take any transport on the day of Saturday. They won't even switch on lights on the day of Saturday. Everything has been done to make it difficult upon them in order to discipline themselves. So Allah here shows within His sunnah that sometimes if His own people don't act a certain way, He will make law more difficult for them in order to discipline the people out of the bad practices that they have. Have a look at this verse, and it gives us some context now to this particular matter. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Surah An-Nisa, verse 160. فَبِظُلْمٍ مِّنَ الَّذِينَ هَادُوا حَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ طَيِّبَاتٍ أُحِلَّتْ لَهُمْ. Because on account of the dhulm that the Jews did, فَبِظُلْمٍ مِّنَ الَّذِينَ هَادُوا. So it's not all the Jews. مِّنَ الَّذِينَ هَادُوا. From amongst the Jews. Because of the oppressions that they did, مِّنَ الَّذِينَ هَادُوا حَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ, we prohibited for them the طيبات, good, easy, beautiful things, أُحِلَّتْ لَهُمْ, that were previously made permissible for them. Very interesting, isn't it? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that they used to enjoy certain types of foods, they used to enjoy certain types of beauties and adornments, things that were tayyib for them, pure for them. But because they abused those freedoms, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it as a consequence to them that He narrowed for them their situation. He made their same dealings much more difficult. But it wasn't just for the sake of doing it. Allah wasn't having fun. He wasn't a disciplinarian teacher, just, who whacked the stick. He says, look, I need you to be able to overcome the bad behaviors with a little bit of discipline. Sometimes a child needs grounding. Sometimes the child, you say, I'm taking away your iPad from you, taking away your phone from you. Sometimes you need to go to bed without dessert, whatever it may be, right? Adnan, what's the way that you get disciplined at home when you're a bit naughty? What's the way? You don't look at Dad. He knows how he disciplines. How do you get disciplined? What does he have to do sometimes?
Maybe no phone, no iPad, no Xbox. Probably no Xbox. That's probably the most.
Probably no Xbox. Yeah. I expected the answer, I never do anything bad. I expected a different answer altogether, but the fact that he's admitted, like, oh, no phone, no iPad, no Xbox, there's a list of things Dad has to use, huh? Okay. So here you can see, sometimes Dad needs to discipline Adnan a little bit. Says, listen, you did this bad, you didn't do this, taking away Xbox for tonight, you can have it back in a week. How long is the punishment normally? A week. Wow, mashallah. Can you see? Now here, the issue with the Banu Israel and the Jews is far more severe than not doing the dishes or whatever Adnan doesn't do at home, right? Look at this. فَبِظُلْمٍ, right? مِنَ الَّذِينَ هَادُوا حَرَّمْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ طَيِّبَاتٍ أُحِلَّتْ لَهُمْ. Now look at the end of the verse. Not only did they do dhulm, وَبِصَدِّهِمْ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ كَثِيرًا. This is major. They hindered many people from the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not an ordinary act. When you change the deen of Allah, or when you stop people from the deen of Allah, then this is a major dhulm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not accept. What were they doing? Verse 161. Verse 141. No, is it? 161, my apologies. 161, the next verse. What were they doing? So Allah immediately explains in the context the kinds of things that they were doing. See, it's a bit ambiguous. Dhulm, many types of dhulm. وَبِصَدِّهِمْ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ كَثِيرًا. They used to block people from the path of Allah, but it doesn't explain what they were doing as an example. In the next verse, 161, Allah actually gives some examples of what they were doing. وَأَخْذِهِمُ الرِّبَى وَقَدْ نُهُوا عَنْهُ وَأَكْلِهِمْ أَمْوَالَ النَّاسِ بِالْبَاطِلِ. They took riba, interest, despite its prohibition. So they knew it was haram, but then they would continue to participate in this act. And they used to consume people's wealth unjustly. Right? Things like selling on debts to others to be debt collectors, and then with that would be extra charge rates. So for example, if Shokar Uncle owes me 50 pounds, and I sell his debt to Ali, then when Ali comes to pick up the debt from you, he says, it's not 50, it's now 75. Right? He's added on 50% of the debt for himself, just to go and collect it. This is haram. This is the things that they used to do. Right? So not only would they do riba, they would also eat up wealth in falsities. وَأَكْلِهِمْ أَمْوَالَ النَّاسِ بِالْبَاطِلِ وَأَعْتَدْنَا لِلْكَافِرِينَ مِنْهُمْ عَذَابًا أَلِيمًا. And now Allah doesn't just call them Jews, like He did in verse 160. What word does He use? Kafirin. وَأَعْتَدْنَا. We have prepared for them, or we have prepared, لِلْكَافِرِينَ, for the disbelievers, minhum, amongst them. Yeah? So Allah is not calling all Jews here disbelievers. لِلْكَافِرِينَ مِنْهُمْ. Those who are actually disbelievers from amongst the Jews, عَذَابًا أَلِيمًا, a painful chastisement. So here we have dunyawi, worldly repercussions, and we have akhirah repercussions. Now, what I want you to just think about is this, in the context of preparing for our discussion on Sunday night, inshallah, our series. Can you see here how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a sunnah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a sunnah. Adnan, just make sure everything's okay. Thank you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a sunnah, and the sunnah is that if those people of certain faiths, or his faiths, act out in certain ways against his deen. Sorry, the brother was just looking at the screen. I just wanted to, in case he was looking for something. So if Allah's way is that sometimes you get someone or a group of people within the faith and they are acting against that, Allah uses certain means to be able to discipline them, to be able to make them change their ways. This is within the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he shows it to us with Banu Israel and the Jewish community. Is it possible, do you think, that Allah has to do this with the Muslim community? What do you think? Yes? Yes. At the time of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam, if you open chapter number 58 from the Quran, Surah Al-Mujadala, verse number 12. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even has to discipline the Muslims in order to get them to change their behaviors. Very interesting, isn't it? Sometimes we point fingers and we say, oh, look at what the Jews did. Right? Actually, in the Quran, the same way Allah has to change his own laws temporarily or permanently in order to discipline the Jews, he also has to do the same thing to the Muslims in order to be able to make them a different type of people, come out of the situation differently as a people. Have a look at this ayah, chapter number 58, Surah Al-Mujadala, verse number 12. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu. So immediately you know this, the verse is in the context of the mu'mineen. إِذَا نَاجَيْتُمُ الرَّسُولِ فَقَدِّمُوا بَيْنَ يَدَيْ نَجْوَاكُمْ صَدَقَةً. O you who believe, when you wish to have a private counsel with the Prophet, present before your consultation, your private discussion, some charity. ذَلِكَ خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ وَأَطْهَرٌ. This is better for you and purer for you. Now, what is the reason for this? Does anyone know the reason why this ayah was revealed? Yeah. There were people at that time, especially the powerful, they used to go and sit with the Prophet for a lengthy amount of time in order to take his time to be seen with the Prophet, and in order to block the poorer and ordinary person from having access to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So they used it as a means of showing off, as a means of saying to their buddies, did you see how important my discussion was with the Prophet? My discussion took a whole hour. Your discussion wasn't long. My discussion took an hour. Can you imagine how important I must be for the Prophet to give me a whole hour of his time? Now the Prophet had far too much akhlaq to say, please leave. Right? Allah had to intervene. Did he intervene on the 10 or 20 or 50 people that were abusing the Prophet's time? No. He intervened and told the entirety of the Muslim Ummah, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, all of you, if you wish to have a private consult with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, first you have to be able to give some charity. That's better for you. Why charity? Why give a payment? Should it cost you to visit the Prophet? Should it cost you to sit with the Prophet? So why do you have to give charity? Because it weeded out those people who were not serious about visiting the Prophet. You see, those people who were abusing the Prophet's time and just wanted to be seen with the Prophet because it was some sort of personal notoriety between them and their gang, their friends, they weren't going to bother paying charity to visit the Prophet. They were too stingy to do that. They wouldn't want to do this. So they would just they wouldn't give. And in fact, nobody would give charity. Nobody gave charity in order to visit the Prophet except for one only person, Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib, salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. And as a result, in history, the only person to fulfill this ayah of the Quran was Imam Ali alayhi salam. Afterwards, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, now that I've taught you that you shouldn't be abusing the time of the Prophet, it's not for you to be able to, use the Prophet for your own personal reputational gain. And everybody understood this practice. Allah stopped that practice. He said, you no longer have to give sadaqah, and actually did what was called mansukh of the ayah, and he actually stopped that ayah from being in practice. He abrogated that ayah from being in practice. The point I raised to you in the context of our series is this is a sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That the sunnah of Allah was and is that where there is the need for discipline, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may intervene on a people and change the laws to make them lighter upon us when we fulfilled something, or make them narrower, stricter upon us by ways of disciplining us. This is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Let us say now, I've introduced this sunnah. How many of us knew about this sunnah beforehand, before this discussion? Yeah? So how many now know about this sunnah and understand it? Yeah? Think about this question. If I was now giving the majlis in the series, what would you take away from that as practice for you and I? Remember, this is the sunnah of Allah. Huh? This is Him understanding the nature of a human being, the nature of people. And He says, sometimes I need to discipline people by making the laws tighter upon them for them to be disciplined. What should be the takeaway for me and you? What happens with Adnan? Does it actually make you do the dishes when you don't do them? Yeah? I'm checking with Dad now. Does it? Yeah, alhamdulillah. So taking away the Xbox for a week, as an example, actually works. It shouldn't have to work, but it works. What do we then understand about our own spiritual nature? Sometimes, if we want to be able to defeat something that is in us, we actually have to impose upon ourselves more disciplinary natures in order to be able to remove certain practices. You see, this is how Allah understands people. This is the nature within our own relationships. Sometimes discipline is a little bit helpful for us. It brings the best out of us, which otherwise would have been lacking. Imagine I have a spiritual shortcoming, whatever it may be. Sometimes I need to be very strict with myself and say that in order for me to overcome X, Y, and Z, I will implement X, Y, and Z upon myself. People do it all the time. People have swear jars. Someone swears, like, I have to put 10 pounds in the swear jar. I can't, not do with that 10 pounds. So over a period of time, they realize that they shouldn't swear. Actually, this very same practice is a spiritual practice for you and I. Sometimes we can actually do something to discipline ourselves spiritually to overcome something that was within us. Amongst the best practices that have been lauded by the Quran and Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam is actually the practice of fasting. Ista'inu bis-sabri was-salah, the Quran says. Seek assistance through patience and prayer. Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam have numerous hadith where they say the meaning of sabr is sawm. Actually, to discipline oneself with fasting. Or, for example, if you were to do something, to give charity. So I'm not going to do this act again. And every time I do it, I'm going to put in £10 in the charity box until you stop doing it. You can see that this is within the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That He changes His laws, makes them easier and sometimes more difficult in order to change a people. And similarly, we can see it upon ourselves as an example. Once, one of the grand maraji', if I recall, it's Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Hussain Burajaddi, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, in his dars. It's a very famous event that occurred in the city of Najaf. One of his students kept sort of interrupting the dars and asking questions and just sort of bugging the class, bugging the teacher, not in a genuine inquiring way, but sort of outside the adab of the class, and kept doing it and kept doing it and kept doing it. Until Ayatollah Burajaddi lost his temper and shouted at the student, raised his voice and said, basically, sit down and shut up. Yeah, basically, like rude. He responded angrily to the student. That night, Ayatollah Burajaddi knocked on the door of the student and gave to him a gift as a way of an apology. He actually gave to him a radio clock, which back then would have been an important gift or a very nice gift. It's not an ordinary thing decades back. He gives him a gift of a radio, apologizes, and says, I have imposed upon myself fasting for 1 whole year. Every day for 1 year, except the days that are wajib to fast or haram to fast. You're not allowed to fast on Eid al-Fitr, for example. Fasting for 1 whole year, every day, in order to discipline myself that I never react the way in which I reacted again. See? It's even permissible for us to go to this level of detail in order to discipline ourselves, to be able to change ourselves. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us tawfiq to be able to remove those spiritual deficiencies that lie within us. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasten the appearance of Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, and allow us to be alongside him at all times in our life and in our death. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Wal asr innal insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilus salihati wa tawasaw bil haqqi wa tawasaw bis sabr. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين أما بعد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wasikum bi nafsi taqwa Allah wal wara'a fi dinina. I call myself and all of you towards God consciousness and piety in the way of the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A couple of weeks back we were talking about Niger and how we can actually see that there is a transformation occurring in front of our eyes. And amongst the transformations that were taking place in front of our eyes in the last couple of weeks has been the BRICS conference, which seeks to be able to bring a number of countries outside of the traditional G7 countries into a more into a sort of a more compact working agreement between themselves. So countries that need to become aligned in order to be able to sort of break the Western hegemony or the powers of the dollar and different global banking institutions have managed to be able to come together and find a way to be able to work more closely together. As an example, you will have heard recently, last week, that China and Iran have done a very large deal, which is to help rebuild part of what I believe is Imam Khomeini airport in Tehran, and to expand its services. Of course, for any country to be a hub for import and export, it needs to be able to have the correct infrastructure around it. And in the last week or so, Iran and China have done a very large deal which allows China to help build this airport for it to become a hub within the region for import and export, and China will actually receive payment from Iran directly by crude oil. Now, those things previously were never thought of possible for a number of reasons, because of sort of the sanctions that were placed upon Iran for them to be able to trade with oil, to be able to pay this, and for China and Iran to be able to work more closely together. What is very interesting is that in the Middle East and in Africa, China's role as a creator of infrastructure is becoming probably the most important country to these two regions within the world. I've already mentioned to you in a previous week how important Russia and China is to the infrastructure of Africa, or the rebuilding of the infrastructure of Africa. Even in Iraq, the infrastructure that is being built in, for example, the city of Karbala, a large part of it is coming from China as well. Now, why is this important? Just think about where we are as a country, as Britain. Our GDP has slowed to 0.4% growth. We have lost 4% GDP since Brexit. And we can see that the infrastructure of our country is actually crumbling. What might happen even in sort of the next 5 or 10, 20 years' time, if Scotland becomes independent of Britain, it actually adds another sort of damage to this country. Think about this very carefully. While countries like China, Russia, and India had 7.3% growth of GDP this year. 7%. Whilst these countries are actually preparing themselves for the next 100, 200 years to be able to invest in the infrastructure across the Middle East and across Africa, sort of embeds itself in the next 100, 200 years of these regions. This is what China is doing. This is what Russia is doing. This is what India is doing. Britain, after 13 years of far-right Tory rule, today there was a news report that more than 100 schools might have to be closed down. Because what? Because the ceilings are crumbling. Can you see? Look at the difference between those countries and this one. The vision, the leadership, the direction that is taking place versus where we are at the moment. It's a huge gulf between what is happening. And it's important for us to realize this, especially when we're talking to other people as to where we are, what's actually going to come in the next 20 or 50 or 100 years. The resilience of this country is falling apart in front of our very eyes. This has medium to long-term damage for our own selves as a community. Inshallah, we can discuss this more as this unfolds. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi alladhi la ilaha illa huwa al-halimul kareem, ghafir al-dhanbi wa qabir al-tawb, wa huwa al-ghafur al-rahim. Subhana man sabaqat rahmatuhu ghadabah, wa basata al-yadayni bil-rahmah. Subhana man lam yukallif nafsan duna wus'iha, wa afa 'an as-sayyi'ati wa lam yujazi biha. سبحان من لا يزداد على معاصي العباد إلا كرما وجودا وعلى كثرة الذنوب إلا عفوا وصفحا. نشهد أن لا إله إلا هو العطوف على العباد بجوده والعواد على المذنبين بحلمه. ونشهد أن محمدا نبيه وحبيبه سيد المرسلين وشفيع المذنبين. اللهم صل على سيد المرسلين وشفيع المذنبين محمد صلى الله عليه وآله، وعلى إمام المسلمين وقائد الغر المحجلين أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب صلوات الله عليه وآله، وعلى سيدتي نساء العالمين وبذعة خاتم النبيين سيدتنا فاطمة بنت رسول الله صلوات الله عليها، وعلى الحسن المجتبى والحسين الشهيد بكربلاء، وعلي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي عليهم الصلاة والسلام. اللهم صل على مولانا صاحب الزمان ماحي آثار البدع والطغيان هادم بنية الشرك والنفاق حاسد فروع البغي والشقاق صلوات الله وسلامه عليه وعلى آبائه الكرام ما اتصل الليالي والأيام. اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه واكحل ناظرنا بنظرة منا إليه واجعلنا من المستشهدين بين يديه. اللهم اجعلنا ممن يذكر فتنفعه الذكرى. إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون.